All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the IS's presentation, A Beautiful Night in the Neighborhood, in partnership with the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative and the International Dark Sky Association. Today, we have the pleasure of having Aubrey Larson, the coordinator for the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative. She also works for the Utah's Community Development Office, where she supports rural planning efforts throughout the state. She has her bachelor's degree in landscape architecture and environmental planning and a master's in science in bioregional planning from Utah State University. We also have Sophie Bolina, the assistant coordinator for the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative. She's a senior urban ecology student at the University of Utah and is currently interning with Utah's Community Development Office. She's also a member of the Utah Rural Coordinating Council. And then last, we have John Valentine, who is the Director of Public Policy for the International Dark Sky Association. He has held positions at the National Optical Astronomy Observatories and National Solar Observatory headquarters in Tucson, and has master's degree in physics from Colorado State University and a master's and PhD in astronomy at University of Texas, Austin. Thank you guys for coming. Before I turn it over to those three, just some quick housekeeping items. First off, just from to introduce myself, I'm Eric Yamashiro. I'm the current section president for the Salt Lake City section of the Illuminating Engineering Society. Just a kind of a note from us here at the IES, obviously a lot of things are being postponed. A lot of our events have had to be canceled as well, and we're very sorry for that. But our local board here is doing a lot of work behind the scenes to bring you guys more content that we can, such as this, that'll likely be in webinars or other forms like that. And beyond just the local section, National IES has a lot of online tools that you can use to get continuing education credits just through the education portal on the main website. So for you members out there, make sure you go and check that out. And if anybody who is not a member wants to be a member, now's a great time to sign up. And now for the presentation, if you have any questions during the presentation, there is a drop down for questions in your control bar. Please put your questions in there. We will get to them as they come in, but we are going to be addressing those questions at the very end. If you have questions for a specific person, please be sure to put the name in there. Otherwise, we're going to just get started. All right, take it away.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to turn off my camera just so I don't distract myself. So thanks, Eric. Thanks to the IES for sponsoring this webinar. We're super excited to talk about a beautiful night in the neighborhood and what that means to each of us. And to start things off, I just wanted to reiterate kind of our takeaway message, our purpose this afternoon. And it's really that each discipline, each profession, and really each individual has the power to influence the future of our night skies in positive ways. And that comes from working together to further our common goals and really become better neighbors. And in case you hadn't noticed, our theme is kind of a play on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, a beautiful night in the neighborhood. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't have at least one Fred Rogers quote. So I want to read a quote for you from his 2002 Dartmouth commencement address. So he said, "Our world hangs like a magnificent jewel in the vastness of space. Every one of us is a part of that jewel, a facet of that jewel. And in the perspective of infinity, our differences are infinitesimal. We are intimately related. May we never even pretend that we are not." And without getting too deep, personal, I'll let you interpret what that quote means to you as an individual. But in the context of this afternoon's discussion, we need to recognize that we share this world, that we're all neighbors, we're all one big ecological family, and that our choices, our actions, what we do as planners, designers, engineers, artists, public land managers, whatever your profession is, we really do have the power to influence future generations and improve the quality of life for those that we share this planet with. So with that, sorry if there's a little bit of lag time. Again, I'm Aubrey. I will introduce myself in just a minute, but I'm super excited to have Sophie with me. She's my assistant coordinator for the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative, and we're super excited to have John Barentine with us, who is Director of Public Policy at the International Dark Sky Association. So here's a quick overview. We're each going to talk for a few minutes, and then as Eric said, we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have questions, again, make sure you submit those and we'll hopefully have time to address them at the end. So just a little bit about me. I'm from Utah. I grew up in a small town in Cache Valley, so the northern part of the state. And like Eric said, I studied landscape architecture, environmental planning, and later bioregional planning at Utah State University, which was really interesting because it gives you a perspective of how the built and natural environments can complement each other and work together, how we can plan for an uncertain future and just become more sustainable in a design lens. I also love mountain biking. I have a hamster named Ambrosia. And a random hobby I have is I like to knit food with eyeballs. So if you're in quarantine and need to pick up a new hobby or something, I highly recommend knitting. It's a lot of fun. All right, so the topic for my segment, I decided to call it Won't You Be My Neighbor? I'm going to give an overview of the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative and then a quick refresher on principles for responsible outdoor lighting practices. And then since we are talking about good neighbor policies and practices, I think it's important for us to take a look at who our neighbors are and how artificial light at night impacts those neighbors. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative, it was established in 2012 as part of the National Park Service Call to Action Starry Starry Night. It's a voluntary initiative to celebrate and protect our night skies. And what's really cool is it brings together a lot of different stakeholders. So federal agencies, state agencies, public land managers, tribes, communities, all sorts of different people around a common goal. In the cooperative, what we try to do is support landscape scale night sky conservation efforts. And that can look like a lot of different things depending on the people we serve. So some people have a goal to become a certified international dark sky place. Sometimes the goal is to integrate effective lighting policy, or maybe it's something simple like community outreach or education. We try and support those goals. If you're interested in learning more or want to access some of our tools and resources at our website, seekeydarkskies.org, I encourage everyone to check it out. Okay, so let's go over some principles for responsible outdoor lighting practices. I know for a lot of you, this is what you do every day, but this is important because these principles are what lay the foundation for good neighbor policies and practices and good design. And I wanted to mention that these principles were jointly approved by the International Dark Sky Association and IES in February of this year. And I'll just go through these really quick. So first off, we want lighting to be useful. It should have a clear purpose. We want targeted lighting, should be directed only where it's needed. Use low light levels, so light should be no brighter than necessary. Number 4, controlled. Light should be used only when it's useful. And then 5, color, so using warmer color lights when possible. And we can use technology to help support these practices. Motion sensors, dimmers, clocks, those kinds of things can help us. And again, these are important to keep in mind as we talk about best practices and becoming better neighbors. Okay, so who are our neighbors? Let's take a look. So first off, I wanted to share some examples of wildlife and how wildlife is affected by artificial light at night. And I've kind of structured this in a case study by case study. So my first example is the Tracy Aviary Lights Out Salt Lake campaign. And as many of you probably are aware, there's a lot of different species of birds that actually migrate at night. And they will use celestial cues to help them understand and interpret the nighttime environment. And light pollution emanating from our human development can cause these birds to become disoriented, and they'll end up colliding with windows and buildings. And there's actually millions of birds that are impacted in North America each year. And so Tracy Aviary, their simple solution is to turn out all unnecessary lights between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. during heavy migration periods, so in the spring and fall. And local residences, businesses, building owners are all welcome to participate. And I love this example because it illustrates how if we take the time to understand how wildlife use natural light sources to interpret their environment, we can make simple adjustments to help improve their well-being for birds and other species. My second example is from a town in the Netherlands that is trying to be more bat friendly. So they found that a specialized spectrum of red LEDs helped to preserve nighttime conditions that were critical to a large population of bats. And what's really cool is the motivation behind this change was there was a new development that would bring in about 89 new homes near a nature reserve. And because they were committed to sustainable standards and principles, they wanted to reduce the impact this new community would have on the bats' nocturnal feeding habits without compromising the needs or safety of residents. And so what's really cool about the system is it's networked and capable of dynamic dimming and scheduling. So if there's a resident that wants to change the brightness to an individual light outside their home, they can do that. In the event of an emergency situation, the entire system can be raised to a higher light level to aid first responders. So this example illustrates, at least to me, that we can be adaptable to both the needs of people as well as wildlife. This example is actually from a town that's very close to where I grew up, Nibley, Utah. And Nibley recently adopted a lighting ordinance. And this came after several years of discussion. And the impetus was, what's really cool about Nibley is they have a park there called Firefly Park, which is one of the few public places you can find fireflies in the Western United States. And they found that light pollution could be harmful to fireflies and their ability to reproduce. And so the city implemented this ordinance. It does not require homes to comply, just new and upcoming developments and projects, but they do plan to use some education campaigns. And while the fireflies were the impetus for this policy change, another big part of it was wanting to maintain the look and feel of their community. Nibley wants to feel like a small rural town and preserve their rural character and sense of place. And so this example illustrates how, sometimes language we use can help to communicate the importance of night sky conservation. Sometimes the environmental narrative, or sometimes called an agenda, isn't always the most effective way to communicate these things. And sometimes if we can change how we talk about dark skies, appealing to rural character, to heritage, those kinds of things, that can help us be more successful in communicating the importance of this message. And for Nibley, it helps them to feel less restricted and more empowered to protect an important part of their community's identity. All right, so let's look at some examples from plants. So botanical light pollution, we know that light sources can affect vegetation. And what's interesting is some botanists have found that red light can negatively impact certain plant species. So if you think back to my example with the bats, maybe we need to ask some more questions or follow up with that example to see what's going on. They found that even low levels of light trespass from roadways and other outdoor areas that are illuminated can be harmful to both wild and domesticated plants. And farmers have actually seen the effects on soybean crops. That's the image you hopefully can see. And they found that high pressure sodium roadway lighting actually reduced crop yield by 20 to 40% due to delayed flowering and ripening. There's a publication from Purdue University that actually lists 65 trees and shrubs that are vulnerable to artificial light. They've also found that different light types, so high pressure sodium lamp, LEDs, these each have different implications on the natural environment. And this is something that lighting designers need to consider. It's something we need to be aware of. So acknowledging the physiological state of plants and that they're really solutions are not one size fit all. So what's good for the bats might not be great for the soybeans. So asking hard questions, considering is it possible for us to reduce the amount of light in this area to improve the well-being of the wildlife and plants that inhabit the space. Okay, let's take a look at nocturnal pollinators. So botanical light pollution has detrimental effects on plants, which in turn can impact the pollinating insects that depend on those plants. There was a study done by some scientists in Switzerland, and they found that 67 or 62% fewer insects visit artificially illuminated plants in their study. And pollination is essential for reproduction of many plant species, and a lot of that pollination actually occurs at night. And they also found that the pollinators who work during the day, so diurnal pollination, they were not able to make up for reduced activity of nocturnal pollinators. And there's a couple different reasons for that. We know that artificial light at night will misdirect pollinators, and it can also disturb circadian rhythms in plants, just as it can in people. And so acknowledging that we're still learning, there's more research that needs to be done to understand these relationships, and that there's interconnectivity of all these different ecosystems. So insects that pollinate plants that people eat, there's important feedback loops that need to be considered by all of us as we develop our communities, as planners prepare for the future, really understanding the interconnectivity of things. All right, this is more of a fun example, going back to my landscape architecture days, but not all environments are meant to be enjoyed during the day under light or under artificial lights. There's something called a moon garden, which is a garden meant to be enjoyed by the light of the moon. So rather than lighting up a garden with artificial light, you can include plants with silvery gray leaves, interesting textures, or white flowers that will actually appear to glow under the light of the moon. And what's really interesting is there are some plants that only bloom at night, and then some plants will release sweet fragrances in the evening. So sometimes we can embrace natural darkness, and it actually can improve the experience of a place, improve the aesthetic quality and our experience with that environment at night. Okay, last of all, I have some examples of some awesome people who are being good neighbors. My first example is from Torrey, Utah. For those of you who are familiar, Torrey actually became Utah's first certified international dark sky community in 2019. And really it was because of a person, her name's Mary Bedingfield Smith. She started asking questions about how she could improve her ability to see Capitol Reef National Park from her home because of nearby streetlights that were restricting her view. And I have some more quotes. So this is a quote from Mary. She said that when we talk individually, we can discuss specific lighting needs and what can be done to get there. Without individuals and associations working together, the last remaining dark areas on the planet could well disappear without anyone noticing. So she learned how important it was to talk to her neighbors, to get down on their level and understand their concerns and their goals, talking to community leaders. She even was able to project energy cost savings if they were able to adopt more energy efficient lights that were also more dark sky friendly. They were creative in their fundraising to help to change out those fixtures, and then partnered with Arcane Power to switch out their old lights for the new, more energy efficient dark sky friendly lighting. So having those candid conversations and really being a good neighbor in your community. I wanted to mention the University of Utah's Dark Sky Studies minor, and I have another quote from Daniel Mendoza, who is co-director for the Consortium of Dark Sky Studies. And he said, there are no formal academic educational programs strictly for dark sky study and protection. The new classes regarding dark sky studies are our way of teaching a very diverse group of students here at the U how to think about a complex problem and to make real changes in their communities. So this is such a really, it's so cool. I wish this had been something I could have studied when I was going to school, but it's the first of its kind. It's multidisciplinary, bringing in lots of different professions, and then it's collaborative. And I love this example because I think this is how the real world should work. We should work together to solve complex problems and make changes in our communities. And I'm excited to see where this program goes in the future. All right, my last example is probably my favorite, the Kaibab Paiute Reservation. It's in northern Arizona. It's just south of Kanab, if you've ever been to Kanab. They became the world's first certified international dark sky nation in 2015. And I had the privilege of interviewing Daniel Bullets, who is their special projects director. And this is what he said regarding dark sky conservation. For the tribe, dark sky conservation is different than for cities and towns in many ways. We see sky conservation as a teaching tool to help us reconnect with songs, stories, dances, and the spirituality of what the dark night really means to the Paiute people. So when they began pursuing this idea, this certification, they were able to uncover songs and dances that had not been performed since the 40s and stories that had not been told since the 50s. And now they're able to teach their youth an important part of their culture that was actually considered lost until this designation occurred. So what a really cool example of the importance of passing on culture to future generations, to family, of remembering things that were lost, and it's all tied to night sky conservation. So with that, I'm going to give the controls to Sophie, but just remember, as Fred Rogers says, we are intimately related and that we should never pretend that we're not, and that we are all neighbors and we all have an important role to play. So Sophie, your turn.
Cool. Thank you, Aubrey, and hello, everybody. And I am going to welcome you to my virtual neighborhood, if that works. Okay, there you go. Okay, so again, my name is Sophie Bellina, and I am the assistant coordinator for the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative. And Aubrey already gave us a great introduction into the concepts and issues of light pollution, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how communities deal with outdoor lighting and some other great neighborhood stories. But first, I want to again introduce myself. So I am currently a student at the University of Utah. I'm finishing up my bachelor's degree in urban ecology, and I'm minoring also in dark sky studies. I joined the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative as the assistant coordinator in November of last year, and have since been able to expand my knowledge, which I've gained in my dark sky study courses, and apply them in different communities and neighborhoods throughout the Colorado Plateau. One thing I think that will hopefully make you remember me is I love rubber duckies, and I make my husband accept any new yellow addition I bring to my home. But anyway, so I originally grew up and traveled a lot through Europe. And so in case you were wondering where my accent is coming from, I am from Austria, which is also the reason why I want to talk a little bit more about lighting in Europe and Austria, because I think it's a really interesting conversation to have, and it's usually not that common to talk about those things. Back then, when I still was living there, I didn't really pay much attention to outdoor lighting or the night sky in general. And even though I haven't been back recently, I still very vividly remember the light flooded streets of downtown Vienna. So I did some research, and I noticed that the US is leading the dark sky conservation movement. They have a bunch of parks, communities, and reserves that are certified through the International Dark Sky Association, while in Europe, there's only a handful of communities and parks. There is unfortunately also not really a lot of dark sky conservation going on in Vienna. Most of the streetlights have a color temperature of 4,000 Kelvin, especially since they just came to an agreement that all city-owned lighting has to be 4,000 Kelvin rather than 3,000, as it is preferred. Most of the lighting fixtures are not fully shielded, which also results in the fact that most streetlights in Europe, in Vienna, are suspended between the buildings because of the dense development. So if it's really windy, we all get a free light show. On the other hand, I was looking at some aerial imagery and especially infrared aerial images of cities at night that were done with a visible infrared imaging radiometer suite. They might appear like they might appear darker compared to a few years ago, especially if you look at like 2012 versus 2015, but they probably have become even brighter than they appear. This is due to the change of cities changing their lighting to LED lights because they're simply more energy efficient. One good example is the city of Milan. They took aerial imagery using an SLR camera that were attached to a Earth tracking device, and they really picked up the change from a warm light to more bluish lighting. And the visible infrared imaging radiometer suite is less sensitive to blue light, so that's why those images actually appear darker. So I think it's a very delicate task to find the right balance of using lighting in cities. All right, so now I want to move towards lighting practices along the Wasatch Front. And most communities are starting to realize that they can save a lot of money if they change their lighting to be redirected, shielded, and consistent. And besides the fact that dark sky friendly lighting is lowering energy consumption and cost, it also has a lot of positive other impacts, as Aubrey already mentioned. And even though I think personally a citywide lighting master plan is probably as important as a parks and rec plan, for example, many communities don't have the resources to create such an extensive plan, but then they just add like a lighting section or lighting ordinances to the general plan, which I feel like is still a really big accomplishment. So two examples, so I picked two communities as examples to talk about the lighting practices. And one of them is Salt Lake City. They have a master plan that is from 2006, but they're currently working on updating that plan. So they're 90% done, and hopefully once this pandemic is over, they will soon be able to publish all of that and start accomplishing their goals. Part of the plan is to change all the 15,600 city-owned lighting fixtures to be LED lightings. And they also are testing smart lighting technologies such as timed dimmers to use light only when we actually need it. So like during rush hour, they're trying to have the light at 100%, but then like during the night at like 1 or 2 a.m. when there's less traffic, they're trying to like dim the lights to like 50 or 60%. The city will also try to maintain neighborhood characteristics through neighborhood specific lighting, but they will also try to put an emphasis on dark sky friendly lighting altogether. The other community that I want to highlight is South Salt Lake. They completed their lighting master plan in 2008, so it's fairly recently, and they're currently working on implementing all their goals. So since I started working for the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative, I try to be an influence for good lighting practices in my community. And I live along a road that is fairly busy, even at night, but there's barely any streetlights. And the few that are currently there, they're not working. So it's kind of dangerous to walk my dog there at night. On the contrary, there is what is it called? There's a lot across the street that just added, I think, 15 floodlights that have a color temperature of 4,500 Kelvin. So it's extremely bright and really confusing for people walking there. It's confusing and dangerous for drivers. But what really surprised me is how it actually affects the birds. When I take my dog out at night, I still hear birds chirping at night, like at 9 or 10 p.m., which is kind of concerning. So I reached out to both. I reached out to my city and was thankfully able to have them add lighting to the road, so it's more safe. It's safer now to walk that night. However, like with the property across the street, I unfortunately wasn't able to achieve anything. So I just want to mention this because I feel like as community members, we have the ability to talk to our neighbors, and it's really important to talk to them in a holistic way. So we as a community create an environment that is good for us, but also our neighbors in the natural environment. So as I said, like the property across the street for me is really bright, and that's just a really good example that there's still 1,000 of properties that are still overlaid and bothersome to adjacent residents. Another really good example of those kinds of properties are car lots. They are usually super bright and everybody can make them out if they fly with an airplane over a city. The other thing is also that I understand that vanity lights, spotlights, and other large-scale outdoor lighting elements are a popular tool to use for architects, designers, and engineers. However, I sometimes feel like that they probably could cause more harm, like unintended harm, than pleasure. All right, so the last neighborhood I want to talk about is actually a whole town. As part of my dark sky minor class, I got to go to Helper, Utah, which is a rural community just 2 hours southeast of Salt Lake City. And even though they seem fairly close to the waterfront communities, they actually have some really beautiful night skies that need to be preserved. So we went down there to take lighting measurements to help with their application to become an international dark sky certified community. We did take those lighting measurements with the newly developed drone technology, and the drone was developed by a group of students from the U's engineering department. And the cool thing about the drone is it can take SQM, like sky quality meter measurements, from an elevated position, while at the same time take illuminance measurements from like right underneath. So this allows us to see how outdoor lighting directly affects the night sky above. We also served as a community liaison to town residents to talk to them about the importance of conserving the night skies. And I feel like this is also a really big part of night sky preservation, just to talk to your neighbors and share what you know and maybe help them understand that certain lighting might not be the best. Generally, most residents in Helper want to preserve the night skies. However, they oftentimes don't really know how to. So we had like a conversation about good lighting practices, shielding your lights, turning them off when you don't need them, using low, like 3000 Kelvin light temperature and so on. But just in general, we talked to them about how to be a good neighbor to each other, but also to our neighbors in the natural environment. The good news is Helper was awarded to be Utah's second international dark sky community just last month, which I feel like is a good accomplishment. And with that, I am going to turn it over to John, who's going to talk about policies.
Okay, thank you, Sophie, and thanks also to Eric for the invitation to speak to you today. My name is John Barentine, and I am the Director of Public Policy at the International Dark Sky Association. As Eric alluded to earlier, my background is in astronomy, and I was an academic astronomer for a number of years. And then I started getting into science policy work and a little bit of law and public policy, and the job that I have now with IDA really combines both of those together. So if I can get this to advance. What I'm going to talk to you about in the last third of the presentation here is about how we take some of these ideas that Aubrey and Sophie have been talking about and translate them into policies. These are things where we're now going from sort of the realm of voluntary actions to things that are increasingly required by law, and we think as a result some of those changes in behavior will stick if they are written into law. So briefly, what I'm going to talk to you about is the issue of nuisance under the common law, which is the basis for a lot of the complaints that we get from people who are having problems with their neighbors involving outdoor light at night, and how we can solve that problem before it even starts with good lighting design. I'll talk to you about lighting trespass, what it is, why it is the source of the problem, how it can be remedied, how to find the appropriate kind of lighting for your design work that will avoid some of these problems from the get-go. And then the last part of what I will speak to you about is about the actual policies. How do we do this? How do we write lighting policies into law in areas from local cities and municipalities all the way up to countries? What are the features of them? What do we look for? And how do they work in order to make the nights a little bit friendlier for everybody who lives in the neighborhood? So first of all, the notion of common law comes from a long and ancient legal tradition that goes back to England in the Middle Ages. And one of the principles that is certainly hundreds of years old is the notion of nuisance. The common law is a set of cases and traditions that are not necessarily written laws, but are the ways that people chose to govern each other throughout our history before the modern notion of law took over, sort of in the Renaissance period. And the basic tenet that underlies common law is the sense of doing no harm to others, whether that is intentional or by omission. So it's sort of like if we took the golden rule and put it into legal practice to say that we should be considerate of other people and their concerns and their property just as we are with ours. And so the element of common law that applies most directly in the case of outdoor lighting is a nuisance. And it's this idea that the use of one property owner's land causes an interference with the use and enjoyment of somebody else's land. And the common law really proscribes that, says that that should not arise in the first place because we're all supposed to be considerate about our neighbors and about the uses of our land. There are two kinds of nuisance that apply in the case of lighting. One of them is public, so it is a situation where you would have some sort of lighting installation that was causing harm to sort of the shared spaces in our society, versus private nuisance, which is mainly one neighbor against another. And we get a surprising number of calls in my office every week that start out to the effect of, my neighbor has a porch light. And everybody who's listening to this probably can identify with the situation where you have an exterior light fitting on somebody else's property, maybe next door or down the street. That light is shining in your windows at night or is otherwise considered intrusive to your property. And that would constitute a private nuisance. And the law deals with these two kinds of nuisance a little bit differently. And the law looks at a balancing act to try to resolve differences between neighbors. It's not unreasonable for your neighbor to want to light his or her property. What becomes unreasonable is to the extent that that light leaves the property, which is what I'm going to talk about next, in the form of light trespass, and falls on your property, say, in a way that you don't appreciate and would rather not be the case. So the law provides for different kinds of damages or injunctions against property owners that violate common law nuisance. But we hope that good lighting design and consideration for neighbors will result in, again, the problem being dealt with before it starts. And so the mechanism of nuisance as it involves outdoor lighting is this thing called light trespass. And the little cartoon picture on the left over there shows graphically what we mean by this. It's simply light that is emitted on one property and falls on another property. That means it crosses the property line. If it does that, the conditions of light trespass exist, and typically under common law, that is considered a form of nuisance. There are communities throughout the US and the rest of the world that, as a matter of law, identify light trespass as a condition that's not allowed to exist. And therefore, there's a statutory condition of light trespass that can result in penalties if people don't resolve their differences and end the trespass condition. But even in places where there's not a law necessarily that involves light trespass, neighbors can, in principle, take one another to court over the issue, again, under that notion of the unwritten common law. Sometimes light trespass is defined in city codes according to a threshold. So it will say that the amount of light crossing the property line cannot exceed a certain number of foot candles to give it a sort of quantitative measurement. Whereas in other cases, the code might say something only like, if the light is directly visible from another property, then conditions of trespass occur no matter what the illuminance that's received on the second property. And it also need not be simply a situation involving direct neighbors. Even if you do not share a property line with another property that's emitting light that's falling onto your property, it can cross multiple property lines before it reaches the target and creates the conditions of nuisance. So through design, as much as possible, we're trying to prevent this from happening in the first place so that these disputes among neighbors don't break out. So there are ways around this, and mainly it has to do with the way lighting is designed and installed. If it's done properly, trespass won't exist. You'll have the right amount of light on your property, and you won't annoy your neighbors in the process. We have a program called the Fixture Seal of Approval, which you can find on our website at the address that's listed in the lower right. And the listing requirements for the program are on the left. These are things that are mainly in line with the lighting principles that Aubrey described earlier, that are the joint effort recently between my organization and IES. And they're the kind of things that you would imagine. They're full shielding requirements, so that there can't be any optics like drop lenses or sag lenses, reflectors, etc., that cause light to be emitted above the horizontal plane. And that will keep the light on the ground where it's needed and out of the night sky. But you still, of course, need good design to ensure that that downward directed light stays on the property that it is intended to light and does not create conditions of trespass. We also have a requirement that the correlated color temperature of the lighting cannot exceed 3000 Kelvin. So we're trying to avoid some of those, especially biological impacts that both Aubrey and Sophie mentioned earlier. The mounting orientation has to be non-adjustable. So in other words, no knuckle mounts. No ability for the end user to change the orientation of the light after it is installed, so that if it is designed and installed correctly to be fully shielded, it remains in that condition after it is installed. And finally, that photometric testing data are made available from accredited labs, and that's how we make the judgment as to whether the light meets our criteria. And then manufacturers of products that receive the IDA seal of approval are allowed to use that service mark over there on the right to identify themselves on their product packaging and in their advertisements. So you can quite literally walk into your favorite home improvement store, pick up a box off the shelf containing a lighting product, look around on the box, and you'll find the IDA seal if it is in fact approved by our program. So let's say that we get to the point that enough people in a community or a state, for example, would like there to be some binding requirements on society to improve outdoor lighting through changes in behavior. We do that through public policies. And that's most familiar to people through local municipal lighting ordinances, which are a form of binding and more particularly statutory policy, like in the tree on the left under the word binding. But we have other approaches to that besides ordinances. In the United States, policies about outdoor lighting are generally made on the local level, although there are some states that have their own state-level policies. The United States itself does not, but other countries have national-level policies where their governance systems are a bit different, and there's less local control. So as an example, in the United Kingdom, they used a system of planning permission that's done at the county level. So individual municipalities don't have a great deal of influence on that, but property owners have to get permission before they're able to actually install lighting on their property, and that's done through their counties. So these planning frameworks are more of a regulatory situation rather than a statutory one. But we can also look at things like energy codes and building codes under regulation as a way of affecting outdoor lighting. And then even in places where the community might not be ready to make it binding yet, we have other ways of expressing the will of the people through things like legislative resolutions or even voluntary standards. And then down in that kind of cloud in the lower right corner are all of these other things that influence policies. And these are court decisions, are legal traditions, and as I was alluding to earlier, the common law. It's this body of decisions and ideas that have come about over the centuries that still guide some of our practices today. So mainly from here out, we're going to focus on the local ordinances, because in the US, that's where most of the policy action on outdoor lighting is taking place. So some of the things that we think about when we're crafting these policies are issues of jurisdiction to make sure that we're regulating outdoor lighting behaviors correctly according to what powers are granted to the local jurisdiction. Some communities have home rule in certain states in the United States so that they're allowed to make these laws for themselves, whereas in others they don't have the power of home rule, and their policies are largely dictated at the state level. So we need to know what the sense of legal supremacy is. What jurisdiction controls when we're trying to set outdoor lighting policy. We're looking at ways of regulating the behaviors with regard to outdoor lighting, and this may be either positive or negative. So in other words, a policy might deliberately allow a certain type of behavior, whereas it prevents another legally. So we can come about it through either way. Either we're trying to encourage people to do something that's good, or trying to discourage them from doing something that's bad. Oftentimes people will ask, what they can do about street lighting that shines in their windows at night. And because of this legal principle called sovereign immunity, there's not much you can do other than ask your local council very nicely to maybe put up a shield, because under this legal principle, you can't usually sue the government. So the redress that takes place in that case is through politics. If you don't like the way your community is governed, you can elect new leaders. And lastly, we look towards best practice as a way of informing policy decisions. And organizations like IES are very crucial in that they create these best practices for outdoor lighting. And we can point at those and say, if your community wants to be seen as following what experts recommend, look at IES's recommended practice documents, look at IDA model policies, for example, and that helps set a standard that then people can feel good about, that they have tried to get the best informed ideas that go into their policies that have been vetted by the experts. So what makes for a good lighting policy? And this again goes back to the lighting principles that Aubrey mentioned. And a lot of the same ideas are embodied in these bullets on the right. And if we could get all of these items into a local lighting ordinance, for example, IDA would certainly be very happy with that and would give them a pat on the back and an attaboy for doing the right thing. And it's mainly about how we use light and thinking differently so that we ensure that the lighting is warranted, that it's serving a purpose, enabling task performance at night in a way that's safe. Lighting zones, which are an idea of putting on the sort of overlays on top of land use zones that are common in the United States, are a great way to do that, because then it defines what kind of lighting is allowed in certain parts of cities or what is not. Lighting levels, that sort of thing all goes with the zones. And we have a set of definitions of zones that cities can use for their overlays. Of course, full shielding, prevention of overlighting. Sophie showed the example of the car lots, which are often excessively lit at night relative to what their stated intent is, so that by placing reasonable limits on that, we can ensure that one property is not vastly brighter than the ones that are around it. And that again can also scale according to the lighting zone. We look at spectrum management, so we definitely want to ensure that we're not emitting too much of the kind of light that we know is damaging to both biology and the night sky. We're encouraging municipalities to add the use of adaptive controls like motion sensors and timers to their codes. In that way, if a person wants a very bright floodlight on their property, they're able to have it, but that light is only on when it is needed, and otherwise it's shut off. And lastly, we encourage municipalities to include a form of plan review so that the municipality knows before lighting is installed what kind of lighting is proposed for a given property, and that it complies with the code. So if we can get all of these things into a local lighting ordinance, we feel like they're doing a pretty good job. One of the things that IDA does is creates, evaluates, and distributes model policies for different jurisdictions. Some examples of those are shown here. We worked with IES almost 10 years ago to create the Model Lighting Ordinance, which is our standard model policy for all kinds of different municipal situations. It's available from our website at the address that's shown in the lower left. The MLO is coming up on, again, about 10 years at this point, and technology has changed as well as lighting practice. And so we're looking at working with IES in the coming year to substantially revise the MLO, make it a little more user-friendly, and hopefully get it into the hands of more people in municipal governments who can use them. We've also created a couple of other policies that are currently in draft form right now that are waiting final approval by our board. We have a new policy for smaller U.S. municipal jurisdictions that are a little more targeted towards their needs. And we also now have model legislation for U.S. states that we're trying to get our advocate community through our chapters to find good, reliable sponsors in state houses all over the country. Again, same sort of core principles that are embodied in the model ordinance, but at a state level, so mostly applying to publicly owned lighting throughout states, which turns out in some cases to be a pretty significant fraction of overall light emissions. So we're constantly updating and refining these and trying to make them more useful for the target audiences and providing them with language that's really legally durable and ready to go out of the box. And so to wrap up all of these ideas about policy, we think that if you combine good practice, the right kind of lighting products that are the type that are approved in our fixture seal of approval program, and the best types of policies, that we can really have truly beautiful nights in the neighborhood. And these nights would be more like this picture, where the lighting is on one property very well controlled, it's shielded, it's pointed down, it's the right color, it's the right amount of light for the time when people are around and need it. Maybe it's off or otherwise reduced in intensity when it's not needed. And so we keep that light out of neighbors' windows, we keep it out of the night sky. It's better for all of the residents of the neighborhood, be they the human variety or the animal variety. And it keeps neighbors happy. And in cases where we can, again, prevent the problem before it ever occurs, I feel like this is the best way forward that respects the rights of property owners, but also the rights of their neighbors to the enjoyment of their property. And it really does take this cooperative effort by advocates, property owners, lighting equipment manufacturers, and lighting designers, and our respective representative organizations like IDA and IES to all come together to hopefully have these better outcomes. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to throw it back to Eric.
Great. All right, thanks everybody. So now time for our question and answers. I have received a few questions in email and also some in the questions tab. So feel free to send them in either way, and we'll kind of tackle these one at a time. We have about 8 minutes for questions before the hour's up. We'll start with this first question, and I'm going to paraphrase this one a bit, but with the millions of dollars that cities and jurisdictions have already invested in non-dark sky compliant fixtures, are there inexpensive fixtures that cities would be willing to pay for to implement? Yeah.
I can probably answer that, Eric, because it's a question that we get quite often from communities where lighting went in, especially in the first half of the last decade when it was the sort of first and second generation of LED products that had a lot of glare associated with them. Many were relatively high correlated color temperature, and so the very blue-rich white light was perceived as being brighter than it actually was. And it's a very difficult situation for municipal governments that are often, operating on very thin margins and tax bases that have been eroded in the last 10 years. And of course, now we're concerned if there is a recession that follows the coronavirus pandemic, that will further squeeze these governments. The best option for many of these governments is to look into additional shielding for the lights that they have. The cost of new equipment is relatively prohibitive, given that the lights they have now have been in the field for less than 10 years and their expected lifetime is double that. So we don't see a lot of situations where cities are looking to replace equipment that they view as still being very useful. But there are some options for things that they can do to try to reduce the impacts. And of course, going forward in another 5 to 10 years, we're going to begin to see the replacement of that first generation of products. And we hope that more attention will be given to some of these ideas that we've been talking about today to avoid some of what in the past were arguably some mistakes in terms of lighting design and implementation.
Great. All right, another quick question from my email here. I had someone from our city council tell me that many of the older pole-mounted lights are actually owned by and operated by UDOT and not individual cities. Are they on anyone's radar for proposals?
Yes, I can't speak specifically to Utah. Maybe Aubrey knows a little bit more about that, but we see the same effect in other states where a state Department of Transportation will own lighting. In that case, that's something that needs to be negotiated with the state government, and things like our model state legislation addresses publicly owned lighting. In other cases, you will find that the street lighting in an area is not owned by the municipality, but rather is owned by electric utility. And those are often long-term contracts that are negotiated between municipalities and utilities. But when they come due, that's certainly a point that can be addressed in contract negotiations. And in some cases, electric utilities are willing to add shielding or other sort of offsets to lighting that are causing problems in neighborhoods. Aubrey, do you happen to know anything about the situation in Utah?
I just, based off what you said, I don't have additional information, but I do have examples, like you said. In Tori's case, again, they were able to work with Garcane Power, who was willing to come in and help them upgrade their lighting and reduce costs that way. So I think if you're asking questions to the right people, people are usually a lot more flexible and willing to compromise than you'd think.
Okay, great. Okay, our next question. Where does the Tracy Aviary Lights campaign take place?
It takes place everywhere. I mean, you can visit Tracy Aviary's website, but really it's just between those periods in the spring and fall. If you're willing to reduce the amount of lighting that you use between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. I believe if you go to the aviary, it's by Liberty Park, I believe, they have some yard signs you can grab and stick out in your front yard and kind of advertise that, hey, this is bird migration season, turn your lights off if you can. So yeah, everyone's welcome to participate.
I want to add to that they also have 2 events every year. They just had one in March called Birds and Brew. So that's basically when they start to kick off the bird migration season. And they're going to have another one after the summer when, I guess, bird migration season ends, to celebrate how everybody like participated in it.
Right. Next question is, with buildings on hills, can you speak to the challenges for dark sky lights or for light trespass to properties downhill from said properties?
I can speak to that. It's a design question that we get quite frequently. And in any area where you have hills, and I'm thinking of, the foothills, for example, in Salt Lake City, differences in grade become very important in your design. And taking that into account, knowing that if you have a property that's on top of a hill or at a higher grade, that the potential area over which a light could cause trespass is vastly greater than it is if the territory around you is locally very flat. And there's an ability with the right modeling tools to take into account using sources like topographic maps, the differences in grade that will allow you to sort of map the locations where trespass might occur. And then the solution to that is to just apply more strict shielding, which may involve modifying luminaires or having to mount them in particular ways in order to affect a steeper cutoff angle. But it's a great thing to keep in mind when designing in circumstances like that, that if you can see that there are properties around you that are on lower grades, you should assume that the standard method of mounting lights with full cutoff or full shielding characteristics that are mounted essentially flat can still create trespass at relatively large distances.
Thank you. All right. Time for one more question here. And I think this is actually a pretty good one as well. We talk a lot about, and we look a lot at direct light that makes it out to the sky and is addressed through the dark sky approved stamp. But what issue are we, how about the issue that we see from reflected light off of, let's say, a bright colored pavement?
Mhm.
And how
That's sort of the next frontier.
Mhm.
Yeah, that we're going to have to address. Certainly, once we get all of the world's light shielded, we will have done a pretty good job in terms of reducing the amount of direct emission into the night sky. And then the next challenge will be what to do about reflections off of surfaces. If you have fresh concrete or asphalt, the reflectivity is vastly different. You know, fresh asphalt is fairly low reflectivity, but as it ages, it becomes more shiny and more reflective. And we need to also think about that in terms of the wavelengths of light that are preferentially reflected by those surfaces and whether they have a strong color bias to them. There is some research that's being done right now on paving and other kinds of materials that are intended to either scatter light at low angles or absorb more of it. However, we've also got some cities, most notably City of Los Angeles in California, is experimenting with highly reflective pavements to the extent that they're painting surfaces white to try to reduce the heat island effect from absorbed solar radiation during the daytime. So we're of course very nervous about that, because if we increase the albedo of surfaces in cities, we expect that there will be a lot more sky glow as a result. But I think that there's an ability here for us to apply research and development in ways that will get us better surface materials in the future that will absorb more of that light and result in less of it ending up in the night sky.
Great. All right, so we had a few more questions that we don't have time to get to. I know that even though everyone's, well, that most of you are probably working from home, it's you probably still have things that you need to do today, so we will cut the question Q&A session short there. Just want to thank everybody again for coming and for supporting both IES, the IDA, and the Dark Sky Cooperative. And thank you for your time. John, Aubrey, Sophie, thank you for presenting.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.